A long time ago, I promised a One Piece video about Zoro and Sanji, and at the time, I thought I'd be doing one about the anime and manga. The problem is, that's a really long thing to plan for, and it was kind of stressing me out. Like, how am I supposed to do this? Do I focus on arcs? Do I focus on themes? Do I just sit there and make a 4-hour long video analyzing every single reaction that Zoro and Sanji have towards one another? The answer to that, instead, came in an 8-episode live-action season. So I am very aware of the differences between manga Zosan and OPLA Zosan, but 8 episodes of a live action is way easier to sink my teeth into than the over 100 comic books we have. So today we're going to have a look at the One Piece live action Roronoa Zoro and Sanji and see how we can overanalyze their relationship so much that we come out on the other side all but convinced that they should kiss. Or at least hold hands. And with that line, you should know what kind of video this is. In fact, if you look at my channel, you should know what kind of person I am. I write about ships, I analyze ships, I love shipping, and I don't mean the going merry type. So if that isn't your cup of tea, the door is right there. Also, for my fellow fans of the anime and manga, I will not be comparing the live action to that, except for very specific places where it can't be helped. Because for me, they are different stories with different mediums, and direct one-on-one comparisons are pretty much impossible. If you came for that, I am very sorry. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that will satisfy that for you, so please feel free to find them, because that kind of discourse will not be found here. Lastly, if you like ships and shipping and anything in between, feel free to like and subscribe to this channel, and of course look forward to my 2 other videos that I have planned for One Piece live action, which will be an analysis of Nami Vivi and an overall review. With that, let's get started. I will say that rivals to lovers is my favorite trope. In fact, I think that most of the ships that I like start off as people who seemingly hate each other or challenge each other in some way to become people who mutually respect and admire each other, but still clash a lot because I like that sort of tension. Zoro and Sanji are no exception to that rule, and we know from anime and manga that this is something that has been a key part of their relationship from the beginning. Zoro and Sanji in the live action, though, I have to say they have really stepped it up. Whereas in the anime and manga, there is a lot of physical fighting and sharp barbs here and there, Zoro and Sanji in the live action tends to stick to words and the placement of their own body. Like, for some reason, someone in the cinematography department watched One Piece, the anime, and thought, well, these 2 boys would look good together, and just decided to block them together in every single shot. Like, why? Why is this a thing? Like, why would you always put them next to each other? They're almost always in each other's proximity in a way that seems deliberate and not just for the fact that they are 2 hot guys. While watching the live action, I kept on thinking, why is Sanji next to Zoro of all people? We all know that Sanji is a big woman lover, and in fact, he's very narratively attached to Nami, but for some reason, he always ends up at Zoro's side. It's like someone knows what we're looking for, and it's the 2 of them together at each other's side, like they should be. If you think I'm exaggerating, let's just look at some examples. In fact, let's just look at the very first episode, the very first scene they're together in. Before we even hit the 10-minute mark, Sanji is going directly to Zoro's side, and some might say, well, there's nowhere else to put him. Or maybe he's standing there just so he can look at Nami. But where is Sanji actually looking? Not at Nami. No, he's looking down at Zoro. And I don't think it's his face he's looking at. Over and over again, we see Sanji choosing Zoro's side, or rather, someone in the background is directing him to do so. In Luge Town, they somehow end up being next to each other, a mirror of their framing at Orlong Park. But this time, Zoro isn't hurt and Sanji isn't new. And they have a unifying force now in Luffy. When interrogating Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine, Sanji takes a seat right next to Zoro, and at the end of Little Garden, while Zoro is wrapping his wounds, Sanji quietly takes his place beside him. They are supposed to be rivals, right? And yet, here he is, leaning closer to Zoro. It makes me feel like that person from While You Were Sleeping.
Because it looks like he's leaning.
There are countless moments like these where you sit there as a viewer wondering whether they are actually rivals or whether they just like being next to each other, and this whole rivalry thing is just a front for something more. One of the things I noticed while watching the live action is their obsessive need to be the center of each other's attention. Yes, some people will say that this is the rivalry thing, but I think it's more than that. In almost every scene they have together, they are poking and prodding, begging for the other to look their way, if only just for a second. While we are sailing to Whiskey Peak, Sanji opens the scene playing with his knives, or at least showing off his skill here. The skill that only one other here actually has. Of course, Sanji is probably always showing off his skills with his knives, but in this instance, it feels like it's especially directed toward the only other person in the room who knows how to handle sharp objects. Of course, he could just be talking to Mr. Nine or Usopp, but it's kind of obvious that he's trying to antagonize or maybe get the attention of the only swordsman in the room, setting him up for the jab almost perfectly. Zoro instantly rises to the challenge, saying that the other can only cut up dead things, and Sanji reiterating that despite that, he still has
technique, talent, and style.
Sanji wins this verbal argument, but both get exactly what they want: attention from their rival. There's no need for Zoro to rise to the bait, and there's no need for Sanji to bait him. But despite this, they still do it. And later, the joke leads to Zoro finally finding the upper hand in their previous verbal fight, where he kicks the knife towards Sanji and tells him just how he felt about his technique, talent, and style. But how can I mention Whiskey Peak when there is a scene that is even more important than the knives scene? In fact, I'd say this is the most damning evidence towards my hypotheses that they are more than rivals. After trying to get Sanji's attention, Zoro is visibly upset when he's ignored. Every time before this, he's been the center of Sanji's attention. But here, where Sanji has the attention of everyone, he is virtually non-existent to the cook. Left to the side, Zoro throws a tantrum. It's literally just him, though, by himself, getting rage baited by Sanji ignoring him. And at this point, I'm not quite sure if Sanji is just really ignoring him or just not seeing him. But the point is that Sanji is ignoring Zoro for other people, not giving him the attention that he wants. And so Zoro throws a tantrum. He feels so miffed about it that he goes to the one place where he can get a full view of Sanji and his flirting act at the bar. If Sanji can't see him from the side of the bar, why not in front of it? This man is so jealous, he can't help himself. Which makes his attitude when he finds Sanji and Usopp later even more telling. When Sanji offers to protect Vivi, Zoro shoots him down. Sanji tries to flirt with girls at a bar. Zoro tries to distract him with his brooding self. Sanji wants to go with Luffy and Nami, and Zoro says he wants to go too. At every step of the way, Zoro tries to insert himself into the narrative with Sanji, and it's obvious that he wants to be the center of Sanji's attention, even though we know he's not. Women exist, and Zoro is just a nakama. This is not something we have only encountered here, but also in the anime and manga, and I'm so glad that the writers decided to lean into this. Although there have been major changes in other aspects, this is something that hasn't changed. Zoro and Sanji's dynamic is still just as contentious, or at least a very close and heated rivalry. Most people would think that Zoro and Sanji can't stand each other. From their very first meeting, the two are constantly at each other's throats, trading insults and competing over everything. But underneath all of that bickering is something much more interesting. Their rivalry isn't just about hate or ego, but it's rooted in respect, mutual respect. One that neither will ever admit out loud. Yet it still shows in their body language and facial expressions. Well, maybe more in Taz's facial expressions, because that man is trying for a smirk in every scene, and instead my brain is interpreting it into a flirty smile. There are moments when Sanji looks at Zoro and it genuinely makes me wonder if he's trying to challenge him or seduce him. One of the things I had been worried about that they wouldn't be able to translate well onto the scene was the rivalry between Zoro and Sanji. Sure, it is fun on paper and easy to animate, but bringing it to life in live action is a real challenge. For it to work, you needed two actors who truly understand how this rivalry functions, ones who could play off of each other in a way that felt natural and authentic. Whether or not they achieve that is up to the viewer, but in my opinion, they did a great job. One of the moments that best captures this dynamic is the competition over the dinosaur. I cannot be the only person who watched this and wanted to press their heads together like that one meme. I know they're supposed to be smirking and glaring at each other, but I am definitely seeing something else. In fact, I'd say it comes off as genuine flirting, especially from Sanji. That smirk does not help, and as I mentioned about Taz before, his facial expressions tend to read as flirty in general, but he never looks at other characters the way he looks at Zoro. If he did, I might have been more convinced by Sanji and Nami as a pairing, but with her, it just feels like playful warmth between friends rather than something romantic. With Zoro though, it 100% looks like he's about to devour his face.
In the anime and manga, this would end in some forehead smashing. But
we all know this wouldn't work so well in a live action.
so this sort of thing will have to be left up to the Universal Studios actors.
I have no idea why Sanji followed Zoro into the jungle.
Maybe it just hasn't been established since Luffy and Sanji follow Zoro in Lodge Town, and Sanji seems to follow Zoro without question here as well.
It might be because Sanji knew that the beast was that way rather than thinking Zoro specifically knew where he was going. But regardless of this misstep, it does end with them finding dinosaur tracks, so I guess Zoro failed upward once again. Though I do want to point out that Sanji lets Zoro go first because he is the one with the swords, cutting a path for them even though Sanji is the one technically leading them. I don't know about other viewers, but in this scene, I felt like it was Sanji who knew what he was doing. He's looking for the tracks, taking note of his surroundings, while Zoro projects his very lost feelings. The irony of Sanji questioning Zoro's hunting ability when he's the pirate hunter was definitely one of my favorite jokes in this particular scene. I also love when Sanji complains that Zoro never shuts up, when Zoro is genuinely one of the quieter people on the crew. I think the reason for that is that Zoro is only ever really vocal about things with him. Whenever Sanji says something, Zoro has to contradict it, and somehow they end up in conversations deeper than anything they would get into with the rest of the crew. It's actually kinda cute, and a small look into their little world. A world where a certain swordsman has figured out the fastest way to keep someone's attention is by disagreeing with everything they have to say. As for the dinosaur, this may be a controversial take, but I do think that Sanji killed it. I mean, the sound effects do kind of corroborate this, and yes, Zoro's cut was a deep cut, but as Sanji said, it could have been a flesh wound. Maybe if it were at the jugular, I might have been convinced, but even those sorts of wounds sometimes needs a bit of a bleed out before they're really dead. A crack to the neck though? Sorry, Zoro, I think this one goes to Sanji. Personally, I think that the show is clearly trying to even the score between them at this point, giving Sanji something concrete after Zoro spent most of the previous arc cutting through everything in his path. What I think is very telling about their rivalry is just how much of it happens when the other isn't around. Zoro brings Sanji up unprompted in conversations when Sanji isn't even in the room, and Sanji will perform how very little he cares to anyone who will listen, even when he's fully and truly alone. In fact, there's the one part where he opens Zoro's dossier and throws it to the side like the side of his face is an inconvenience. And then when he gets Crocodile on the phone, there's genuinely no reason to go that hard on Zoro, and yet he does. For someone who is trying so hard to pretend he is indifferent or cares not about Zoro, he sure has a lot of thoughts on the guy, and he must, considering that the other is still Nakama in the end. One of my favorite parts is the part where he calls out Mosshead in the smallest voice possible, knowing he has to call out to the person even though he's not there.
Mosshead.
You can literally just not say his name. Like, it's okay, he wouldn't know anyways. Like, seriously boys, try harder to hate each other because I am still not convinced. On the other side of that though, I think the whole scene with Zoro being taken over by the paint is quite telling of how far their relationship has come up to this point. Sure, it's all fun and games when they're arguing, but it shows here that Sanji and Zoro aren't actually close enough yet to know when something is genuinely wrong with each other. Zoro is clearly losing it from Miss Golden Week's paint, and he even tries to get Sanji to stop and help him, but Sanji reads it as Zoro just being an idiot and walks away. And I'm not quite sure I understand why he doesn't catch that Zoro is laughing uncontrollably, because it isn't like Zoro to do something like that. But I also think that's the point. Zoro knew something was off with him, and Sanji did not catch it. And that's the gap that the show wanted to portray. Although the competition is there, the developing dynamic is there, the real closeness, the kind where you'd notice if something was wrong without being told, is still kind of being built. Despite this, though, I do think that all of it feels very comfortable and natural for them. And to be honest, I really don't think we get that from the source material anymore. For as much as I love the anime and manga, there's just too much going on, and moments between them are few and far between. So getting a whole season that leans into this part of their dynamic and leans into it this much is genuinely genuinely satisfying. If you've made it this far and still aren't convinced that their rivalry is anything other than a very thin veil for something else entirely, I genuinely don't know what to tell you. This essay was always going to be preaching to the choir a bit, and I kind of was writing for the people who already wanted to see what is, at this point, less subtext and more just text. But if you're still feeling on that fence, let me point you to this scene specifically, because I have to ask what exactly the writers were thinking when they wrote this. I mean, yes, every time Sanji opens his mouth about cooking or hunting or making something, Zoro has to respond. It's a natural reflex from him at this point, but Sanji looks him dead in the eye and says,
"Don't you worry about me and size."
How is this a sentence that exists in the show? And the whip staff is positioned in a way that makes it look like their hands are touching. Dear production staff, whoever you are, please calm thy tits. Or maybe do not calm thy tits, because I need more of this in season 3. Even though this is one of the more explicit scenes between the two of them, I think it's still worth mentioning some of the other moments. When Vivi asks to see Nami's leg, Zoro, in his very inebriated state, instantly thinks of Sanji. Which, yes, Sanji would absolutely care about that. But I think it goes to show that even if Sanji isn't in the room, Zoro will find a way to bring him into it.
At the end of the arc, when Sanji finally catches up to the group, Zoro is asking where Sanji has been. Of course, it's supposed to sound like an accusation, but it comes off almost like concern. He could have just ignored him, but nope, Sanji was in his orbit, so he had to say something. Not to mention that motion he makes when Vivi hugs Sanji. Do I detect a little bit of jealousy here?
Look, I know I'm sounding delusional at this point, but this video is supposed to be somewhat delusional.
So let's move on to our next scene.
First off, I really want to say this color looks amazing on Sanji and is actually my favorite color on him both here and in the anime. But I would also like to point out that Zoro and he are just sitting there next to each other, leaning in. Time has officially died from Zosan overdose. Even Usopp knows what's going on. Zoro had been set on going with Sanji and Luffy and Nami up the mountain, but was denied by Sanji, who had made a good enough argument that Zoro didn't feel the need to fight back against, by the way. And I'm sure he understood that splitting up their forces like that would not be good for them, especially if all their fighters went up the mountain. However, Zoro obviously became worried, talking and complaining so loudly that even Usopp got irritated with him. However, it is Usopp's response to Zoro that I want to focus on, because yes, it's supposed to be a joke to lighten up the atmosphere,
but Zoro's words aren't words of argument or deflection.
They were asking if he was listening to him, because yes, he was, and Usopp was like,
"Sanji will be fine."
In the very last scene, and my last proof that their subtext is just explicit text for those who are willing to look and see with their eyeballs, is when all of them are together in the galley, making room in their lives for their new crewmate. Sanji puts down some food for Zoro and the others to share, and instead of just sitting there and minding his own business, Zoro has to say something, and Sanji has to say something back. Of course, one might also call this mirroring, specifically of their last scene together in the first season, where Sanji gives Zoro food in Kokoyashi. Here, there is a smirk, a smile, a slight laugh at their own inside joke. Why are you flirting so openly when there's a child, for goodness sake? As with most things One Piece, our two boys will not be together for too long in Season 3. Eventually, they'll have to split and do their own thing and fight their own fights. But there is one thing I am hoping for that the writers leave in, and that is the scene with Ace and Sanji. I don't know if they'll understand how important this scene is to a lot of people, and it's also kind of a throwaway scene in the grand scheme of things, so I'm not really holding out that much hope, but I just really want to see Zoro get jealous of Ace. Also, Ace flirting with Sanji. I need this. Please, I will die for this. I will become the donut, so please. Anyways, that is all I have to say about this pairing. Again, it takes me weeks, if not months, to complete just one of these videos, so I would really appreciate it if you shared this with other OPLA Zosan fans so we can come together and fangirl in the comments. Also, join me on the Twitch where we go live. We usually talk about IRL stuff, play Hoyoverse games, and also talk about BL. So I would really love to meet my fellow shrimps out there, so come by and say hi. If I didn't mention something in the video, it's probably because I'll be doing it in a different video, most likely in my overall review of the series or my Nami Vivi video, so please make sure to do the subscribe thing if you want to see those. Otherwise, I think I'm going to leave it at this and see you guys in the next one.